Your grandmother probably never called it survival cooking. She called it Tuesday, a pot of neck bones simmering on the back burner, a cast iron skillet of cornbread ready before the sun went down, and enough black-eyed peas to feed every mouth at the table twice. These dishes didn't come from restaurants or cookbooks. They came from women who learned to stretch a dollar until it screamed, using whatever the store had left and whatever the garden gave up. Every one of these meals told the same story. You don't need much when you know what to do with it. Number 41 on this list fed entire church halls for the price of a bag of flour. And number 12 on this list kept sharecropper families alive through winters when the pantry held almost nothing. These weren't just cheap meals. They were acts of love disguised as dinner. So hit subscribe and settle in, because here are 60 cheap dishes our Black ancestors ate to survive. Number 14, catfish in a skillet. A small whole catfish at the Saturday Fish Wagon on Auburn Avenue in Atlanta cost about 40 cents in 1967, and the fishmonger would clean it free if the senior asked nice. She carried it home wrapped in newspaper, patted it dry on a flour sack towel, and rolled it in yellow cornmeal seasoned with a turn of black pepper. Hot grease in the skillet, 3 minutes aside on her coil, and the tail crisped up like a cracker. She set it on a saucer with a wedge of lemon and a slice of light bread folded under the head to catch the drippings. Black widows along the Gulf Coast had been frying small fish on a single burner since the WPA days, when the river gave more than the wage did. Number 21, fatback and onion sandwich. Fatback was the cheapest cut of black butcher in the South, sold by weight in the 1920s, and it traveled like leather. Porters' wives fried it slow until the strips curled into amber ribbons, then layered them with raw onion between 2 slices of bakery bread, bought day old for half price. The sandwich was wrapped in a single sheet of newsprint and pressed under a tin lid to flatten the bread into the meat. By the time the porter sat down on the steps of the baggage car to eat it, the onion had bitten into the fat, and the whole thing tasted like Sunday morning at a kitchen table in Tuskegee. It was a meal his father had eaten, his grandfather too. The train just carried it further than it had ever gone before. Number 19, smothered onions on toast. When there was no meat at all, a skillet of slow smothered onions over day-old bread was breakfast. 2 large yellow onions went into the pan with a spoon of saved drippings, and the heat stayed low for almost 20 minutes. The onions cooked down to a soft brown jam that smelled like supper instead of sacrifice. 2 slices of bread, toasted dry in the oven, got covered with the warm onions and eaten with a fork. It was the kind of breakfast nobody bragged about, but it kept the body going on a morning when the icebox was almost empty. A soft-boiled egg with vinegar and saltines was lost the moment people stopped cooking eggs by feel. In African-American kitchens from the 1940s through the 60s, a grandmother cooking for one lowered her egg into simmering, not boiling, simmering, water and counted in her head. 4.5 minutes for a yolk that was set at the edge and still creamy at the center. She peeled it, sliced it in half, and hit it with 3 drops of apple cider vinegar before it went to the plate with 6 saltines fanned around the edge. The vinegar cut the richness and turned the whole plate savory rather than bland. She arrived at it through years of cooking for herself after the house emptied out, adjusting the same egg she'd always made until it was exactly what she wanted. The timer never learned that. Neither did anyone who came after her. Toast sounds like nothing, and for a long stretch of history, that was the point. You toasted a slice of bread until it firmed, placed it in a shallow bowl, poured warm milk over it, sweetened with a spoon of sugar or a pinch of salt, depending on the house, and let it soak until the bread softened into something between solid and liquid. It had been called sick room food since the 19th century, given to people recovering from illness or to young children who needed something easy to get down. But in Black households during the Depression, when the stove was cold and the pantry held milk and stale bread and not much else, milk toast was simply breakfast. Some households added a drop of vanilla or cinnamon stirred into the warm milk before pouring. Those additions were not in any recipe. They came from whoever stood at the stove and whatever she felt that morning deserved. The last time you had it was probably the last time she was there to make it. And that meant closing the door on everything you couldn't afford to warm. The back bedroom nobody used got sealed in October and didn't open again until March. The dining room, if the family ate in the kitchen anyway, became dead space, unheated, sealed off, a cold buffer between the warm rooms and the exterior wall. This was not a desperate measure. It was logic that predated central heating by centuries, and people who had managed cold houses across generations understood it by instinct. A smaller volume of air is easier to heat and easier to hold. Every square foot you removed from circulation was fuel you didn't have to spend. The women who ran these households made these calculations every fall, deciding which rooms were essential and which were luxuries they couldn't afford until spring. The closed door was the cheapest insulation technology in the house. They used it with precision. Rabbit stew with root vegetables was winter eating in its most honest form. A man went out with a trap or a dog, came back with something, and by evening, the whole house smelled like supper. In rural Black communities through the 1940s and 50s, wild rabbit was free protein when the pantry ran low and the paycheck hadn't come. The rabbit was cleaned, jointed, browned in a skillet, then simmered with turnips, potatoes, and dried onions for hours on a wood stove. The meat turned fall-apart tender, and the broth thickened into something dark and rich. Some cooks added vinegar to cut the gamey flavor. Others let it ride. The men who hunted those rabbits are mostly gone now. But in the 1950s, a man who brought home a rabbit in January was a man who kept his family fed. Number 8, stewed chicken and dumplings. A woman in rural North Carolina could turn the oldest, toughest hen in the yard into a supper that tasted like love had been simmered into liquid. She boiled the whole chicken with celery, onion, and salt until the meat fell off the bones and the broth turned golden. She pulled the bones out, shredded the meat back in, and dropped spoonfuls of dumpling dough into the bubbling broth. The dumplings were nothing but flour, baking powder, salt, and milk. She dropped them in rough spoonfuls that puffed up in the steam and turned soft and pillowy in 15 minutes. The result was a pot of tender chicken, thick broth, and dumplings that dissolved on the tongue. For generations, this was the meal that showed up on your doorstep when someone was grieving. They didn't bring flowers, they didn't bring cards, they brought chicken and dumplings because food was how they said everything words could not. Fried okra arrived at reunion tables in heaping mounds, each pod transformed from slimy vegetable into crispy golden nuggets that disappeared fast. Women sliced fresh okra into rounds, dredged them in seasoned cornmeal, and fried them in cast iron skillets filled with hot oil. The cornmeal coating turned crunchy while the okra inside became tender without the texture issues that made some people avoid it. Children who claimed to hate okra would devour the fried version, often not realizing what they were eating. The dish stretched garden abundance into celebration food. One bushel could feed dozens when transformed this way. Served hot with plenty of salt, fried okra disappeared almost as fast as it hit the table. Fried okra represented Southern ingenuity at its finest, turning humble, man. vegetables into irresistible bites everyone loved. Stewed cabbage with smoked neck bones offered another way to stretch inexpensive meat into something that flavored an entire pot of vegetables. The neck bones simmered first, their smoke and salt infusing the cooking liquid before wedges of cabbage were added to wilt and absorb every bit of flavor. Unlike collards, cabbage cooked quickly, making it practical for women who arrived at church kitchens with limited time. The finished dish was tender but not mushy, each wedge still holding its shape while tasting deeply of pork. This was weeknight food elevated to funeral service, simple, cheap, and deeply satisfying. Families appreciated its practicality and familiar taste during days when nothing felt normal. The cabbage provided vitamins, while the meat offered protein, together creating a complete dish from almost nothing. Pickle juice, brine transformed cheap chicken into something tender and tangy without spending extra money. When pickles were gone, the jar of salty, vinegary brine remained, and grandmothers knew exactly what to do with it. Chicken pieces were submerged in that green-tinged liquid overnight, sometimes mixed with water to stretch it further. Salt and vinegar worked together to break down tough fibers while infusing meat with subtle tanginess. This technique was popular in lean times when buttermilk was too expensive. The juice cost nothing since it would otherwise be poured down the drain. After brining, chicken was patted dry and coated as usual, but the flavor difference was unmistakable. The tanginess added brightness that cut through grease. Grandmothers who used this method guarded the secret carefully. Tomato sandwiches celebrated summer's abundance when gardens produced more ripe tomatoes than families could eat fresh. Thick slices of red tomato were layered between bread, spread with mayonnaise, and sprinkled with salt and pepper. The juice soaked into bread, creating a messy but deeply satisfying lunch that tasted like summer itself. Families ate these constantly during tomato season, knowing fresh abundance would disappear with the first frost. The simplicity was the point because perfectly ripe tomatoes needed nothing more than bread and salt to become memorable. Children helped pick tomatoes and learned to appreciate how gardens could feed families. These sandwiches couldn't travel far because juice made bread soggy, but eaten fresh, they represented everything good about growing your own food. Butter rice with fried eggs was breakfast, lunch, and dinner, depending on what the family needed and what the pantry held. Mothers would cook rice until fluffy, then stir in generous amounts of butter until each grain glistened and carried that rich, creamy flavor. A fried egg was placed. On top is runny yolk breaking open to create a natural sauce that children mixed eagerly into the rice below. Some mothers added a splash of soy sauce or a sprinkle of black pepper for extra depth. This dish was the answer when money was tight but bellies needed filling, providing protein and carbohydrates in one inexpensive bowl. Children loved the ritual of breaking the yolk themselves, watching it flow golden across the butter-slicked grains. It was honest, humble food that required no pretense but delivered complete satisfaction. Number 26, salmon patty supper. A can of bumblebee pink salmon at the A&P cost about 49 cents in 1968, and one can stretch it into 4 patties on a senior's hot plate. She drained the can over the sink, picked out the soft round bones with her thumb the way her mother taught her, and mashed the flesh into a chipped mixing bowl with a cracked egg, a handful of crushed saltines, and a chopped scallion from the windowsill jar of water. A pinch of black pepper, no salt because the tin already had plenty. She shaped 4 flat cakes the size of a tea saucer and slid them into a buttered skillet on the coil. 5 minutes aside, no more, or they went dry. The kitchen smelled like the river road Back home in Louisiana, 2 patties was Tuesday supper. The other 2 went into wax paper for tomorrow's lunch at the senior center, and nobody ever guessed they came out of a tin on a single coil. Number 28, salt pork and day-old biscuits. Salt pork was the cheapest cured meat a black family could afford in the 1920s, and porters bought it in slabs from corner butchers on the south side of Chicago for under 10 cents a pound. Their wives sliced it thin, fried it crisp, and packed it between 2 halves of a hardened biscuit so the grease soaked in slowly over the next 40 hours. It was a sandwich built to survive a transcontinental run without spoiling. The biscuit had been baked Friday morning, sat on the counter through Saturday, and by Sunday, it was hard enough to crack on the table edge. That hardness was the trick. A fresh biscuit would have crumbled in the pail by the second division stop. Porters ate it, leaning over the polishing bench, careful not to drip on the linen aprons. The biscuit absorbed everything the pork gave off. By the time the porter reached El Paso, the biscuit had become the meal. It was salty, dense, and stretched 2 cents into a full stomach. Number 17, hoe cakes cooked on the stove lid. The oldest breakfast in the soul food canon was a flat round of cornmeal cooked right on the hot iron, and it was still on tables in 1965. A cup of stone ground cornmeal, a little salt, and boiling water were the only ingredients. The dough patted out flat between 2 palms, then went straight onto a grease lid or the back of a heavy iron griddle. 3 or 4 minutes aside and the edges were crisp, the middle still tender. Working families ate them split with a smear of lard and a drizzle of cane syrup, and field hands carried the extras wrapped in a piece of newspaper to eat at mid-morning break. Hoe cakes trace back centuries in black cooking, and almost every grandmother in the rural South still made them at least once a week. A sliced tomato with salt and black pepper on white bread sounds too simple to be a meal until you've eaten one in August. Ripe, heavy with juice, pressed between 2 pieces of bread with nothing but coarse salt and a real grind of pepper. And understood that simple is not the same as small. In black households across the rural South, garden tomatoes were the summer pantry. They cost nothing to grow, ripened faster than you could eat them alone, and for an elder living by herself, 1 large tomato was a full breakfast plate. The bread soaked up the juice from the bottom. You ate it over the sink, and the juice still ran down your arm. She knew to salt it first, let it sit 30 seconds to pull the moisture, then press it to the bread. That sequence, salt, wait, press, was the difference between a meal and a wet mess. If you salted it and ate it immediately, you lost. You had to know the wait. She's gone now. The garden is still there. Perdue, lost bread, is what Louisiana Creole cooks called French toast, because the whole point was to save bread already on its way out. Day-old French bread, stale enough to hold the custard without dissolving, was soaked in beaten eggs, milk, sugar, and a pinch of nutmeg, then fried in a cast iron skillet in lard. Always lard in the early recipes because lard ran hotter and gave the exterior a slightly crisp, deeply golden crust that butter alone cannot produce. The dish appeared in Louisiana cookbooks going back to the early 1800s and lived in black Creole households as a morning staple and a way to honor bread that had gone hard. You carried the bread to the pan, not the pan to the bread, meaning you adjusted your timing and heat to match the bread's condition. A plate of pain Perdue cost almost nothing and tasted like deliberate cooking rather than desperation. That alchemy, something nearly ruined turned into something worth sitting down for, was the signature skill of these kitchens. After the biscuits came out, after whatever had spent an hour in the oven finished the baking, the door stayed cracked, not wide open, just a few inches, and the residual heat bled slowly into the kitchen for close to an hour afterward. This was deliberate. On cold mornings, when the kitchen was where everyone gathered before the rest of the house came up to temperature, the oven was the fastest heat source available, and a woman who had managed a cold house for 30 winters knew exactly how to use it. Homestead writers, going back generations, documented baking as a dual-purpose operation, feeding the family and warming the house at the same time. You didn't leave the oven on unattended. That was dangerous, and she knew that too. But the door cracked, the warm air rising in slow waves you could feel on your face if you stood close. That was free, and she never wasted free. Kidney, stew over rice, separated the kitchens that wasted nothing from the ones that had started throwing things away. Pork or beef kidneys, dark, dense, and sharp smelling, was soaked in salt water or milk to pull the bitterness out, then sliced thin and browned with onions and a dusting of flour. The gravy built itself from the drippings, thickened with broth and seasoned with black pepper and Worcestershire. By the 1950s, kidneys cost less than a dime a pound because most families had stopped buying them. But in black households where organ meats were still respected, this stew showed up on weeknight tables all winter. The rice caught the gravy the way a sponge catches water, and every forkful carried that deep mineral richness no other cut could give you. Her mother made it every other Thursday. After she was gone, her daughter tried it once, got the gravy right, but not the timing. She never made it again. Number 17, cornmeal fried catfish. A pound of fresh caught catfish from the levee man cost 11 cents in 1954. He came up the dirt road on Friday afternoons with a wooden cooler on a wagon. Your grandmother always bought 2 pounds. She rinsed the fish in cold well water, patted them dry with a flour sack, and rolled them in yellow cornmeal seasoned with salt, black pepper, and a pinch of cayenne from a jar she'd filled herself in October. A heavy skillet of lard sat on the wood stove at medium high. The fish hit the lard and went silent for 10 seconds. Then it started to sing like a kettle. 3 minutes aside, and they came out crispy gold. She drained them on a brown paper sack from the grocery store. Friday catfish was a Black Catholic tradition the priests had brought down the river from New Orleans. She served it with white bread and yellow mustard. That Friday stayed on your grandmother's calendar. Pound cake arrived at reunions wrapped in foil or displayed on glass stands, its dense golden crumb promising rich satisfaction. The traditional recipe called for a pound each of butter, sugar, eggs, and flour. Simple ingredients transformed through patient creaming and careful baking. Women beat the batter until light and fluffy, then poured it into greased tube pans to bake low and slow. The result was dense yet tender, with fine crumb tasting of pure butter and vanilla. Pound cake needed no frosting, though some served it with fresh berries or powdered sugar. It kept well for days and improved as flavors mellowed. Slices appeared at breakfast, lunch, and midnight snacks throughout reunion weekends. Pound cake represented mastery of basics, proving technique mattered more than expensive ingredients. Banana pudding filled deep dishes at funeral repasts, layers of vanilla wafers, sliced bananas, and homemade custard topped with clouds of meringue browned under broilers. Church women made the custard from scratch, stirring eggs, sugar, and milk over low heat until thick enough to coat a spoon. The wafers softened as they sat, absorbing custard until they melted against the tongue. Fresh bananas were sliced just before assembly to prevent browning, their sweetness essential to the whole. Children circled these dishes, waiting for permission to take portions. The meringue was the crown, beaten egg whites, sweetened and piled high, then baked golden. This dessert was pure comfort, its flavors familiar and its texture soothing. Banana pudding appeared at celebrations and funerals alike, marking both joy and sorrow with the same sweetness. Room temperature resting was the step most cooks skipped, but every grandmother knew was essential for chicken that cooked evenly. Cold chicken dropped into hot grease, shocked the fat and lowered temperature, causing coating to absorb oil rather than crisp properly. Grandmothers pulled chicken from the refrigerator at least an hour before frying, letting it warm slowly while flour coating set and dried on the surface. This rest allowed seasoning to penetrate deeper and buttermilk to fully absorb. The result was chicken that sizzled immediately upon hitting grease, forming a seal that kept juices inside. Without this step, even perfect technique could not save chicken cold at the center. This patience was the difference between good chicken and legendary chicken people still talk about. Fried egg sandwiches provided cheap protein that could be prepared in minutes when nothing else was available. Families fried eggs in whatever fat the kitchen held, usually bacon grease or lard, then placed them between bread while the yolk was still runny. The yolk became the sauce, soaking into bread and creating richness without additional ingredients. Eggs cost almost nothing when families kept backyard chickens, making this lunch essentially free. Workers carried these to jobs, eating them cold when no other option existed. Children learned to fry their own eggs young, taking responsibility for their own meals. The simplicity was the genius because eggs provided complete protein requiring minimal skill or time. Fried egg sandwiches represented the baseline of survival, the lunch made when everything else had run out. Rice and gravy was the ultimate weeknight rescue, a dish that turned leftover pan drippings into liquid gold poured over fluffy white rice. Black mothers knew nothing should be wasted after frying pork chops or chicken, so they added flour to the pan and stirred until browned. Milk or water was whisked in slowly, creating thick, savory gravy that bubbled while the rice steamed nearby. The combination was simple but satisfying, offering protein-rich flavor without requiring another piece of meat. Children loved how the gravy soaked into each grain, turning plain rice into something rich and comforting. This dish represented the resourcefulness of African American kitchens, where flavor was built from what others might discard. It was frugal cooking at its finest, proving that ingenuity mattered more than expensive ingredients. Number 20, hot plate sweet potato. A pound of sweet potatoes at the Saturday Curb Market in Charleston ran 15 cents in 1966, and one fat potato was a senior's whole supper. She did not have an oven in her rooming house, but she had that coil. She cut the potato into 4 thick rounds, set them in a small black pan with a 1/2 inch of water and a pat of margarine, covered the pan with a saucer, turned upside down, and let it steam on low for 20 minutes. The water boiled off and the bottoms caramelized in the leftover margarine until the edges were the color of dark honey. She mashed it on her plate with a fork, sprinkled brown sugar from a Save packet, and ate it with a spoon. Sweet, hot, and filling for a nickel and change. Number 25, sweet potato pie in a mason jar. This is the meal that explains who Pullman Porters actually were. By 1925, the Pullman Palace Car Company was the single largest employer of black men in the United States, and the men they hired came almost entirely from Southern households where sweet potatoes were the cheapest sweet food a mother could put on a table. A nickel of potatoes, a spoon of lard, a pinch of brown sugar, a dust of nutmeg if the cupboard had any. The pie came out of the oven on a Saturday night, was cooled overnight, and on Sunday morning, his wife scooped a thick slice into a clean mason jar and screwed the lid down tight. That jar rode in the bottom of the tin pail across 2,000 miles. It was the part nobody notices about the porter's life. The country saw a black man in a starched white jacket smiling at strangers for 14 hours straight, lifting trunks, shining shoes, hauling slop buckets, taking insults that came with a tip. What the country did not see was the jar at the bottom of the pail. The porter would eat the pie cold, sitting on a wooden crate in the porter's room behind the coal car, the spoon scraping the glass. It was sweet, dense, and it carried his wife's hands in it. Pullman paid him $67.50 a month in 1926 and expected him to buy his own uniform, his own polish, his own meals. The jar of pie was the part of the run that nobody paid for and the part that kept him from breaking. When A. Philip Randolph started organizing the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters that year, he understood that the fight was never just about wages. It was about whose dignity rode in the bottom of the pail. Number 11, tomato gravy over buttermilk biscuits. Nothing on a 1960s Black Southern breakfast table held more memory in one bowl than tomato gravy ladled hot over a split buttermilk biscuit. The numbers behind this dish tell the story of how soul food kitchens stretched a Saturday market trip across an entire week of mornings. 1 quart jar of home canned tomatoes cost about 12 cents to put up in the summer if you grew the tomatoes yourself, and 1 quart could gravy 3 full mornings of biscuits for a family of 5. Buttermilk ran 24 cents a quart at the corner store, and a 5-pound sack of self-rising flour ran 59 cents. Total cost per breakfast, about 8 cents a head. That was nearly a third of what a plate of bacon and eggs cost at the lunch counter on the same block. The method had a rhythm that almost every black grandmother in Georgia, the Carolinas, and Virginia knew by feel. 2 tablespoons of bacon drippings melted slow in a heavy pan. 2 tablespoons of flour stirred in until the roux turned the color of peanut butter. Then the home canned tomatoes went in with their juice, a hard pinch of sugar, plenty of black pepper, and a half cup of evaporated milk swirled through at the very end. The gravy turned from rusty red to a soft pink, thick enough to coat the back of a wooden spoon. The biscuits came out of the oven golden, got split open with a fork, and the gravy poured over the cut sides until it ran down onto the plate. According to oral history projects collected at HBCU libraries through the 70s and 80s, more than 70% of black families surveyed in the rural South named biscuits and gravy as their most remembered childhood breakfast. The tomato version was almost always the one they meant, and almost no one ever forgot the smell of it on a cold school morning. Oatmeal with cane syrup and a spoon of fatback grease was not the oatmeal you know, not the instant packet, not the quick cooking kind with the bear on the box, but thick rolled oats that black grandmothers across the South put on the stove every morning, which came out dense enough to hold a spoon upright and rich enough to carry a person through hard physical labor. The fatback grease was the alchemy. 1 spoonful stirred into the finished oatmeal added savory depth that changed the entire character of the bowl. No longer just sweet and starchy, but layered, filling in the way only animal fat fills you. Cane syrup went in after, drizzled in a slow figure 8 across the top, and the 2 flavors, smoky salt and sweet grass, met in the hot oats and became something neither was alone. Rolled oats were cheap and kept indefinitely. Fatback grease lived in a jar beside the stove in every kitchen she ever cooked in. In 5 minutes together, they became the kind of breakfast that held you until evening. The recipe is gone now, The jar is still on the shelf somewhere. Pot liquor and cornbread gave everything, turning what most kitchens threw away into a breakfast that held a body through a full workday. Pot liquor is the dark, mineral-rich broth left after greens and salt pork have simmered for hours. Former slave Carol Graham of Alabama described children standing around a pot of greens liquor, crumbling cornbread into the liquid with spoons, in WP, a Federal Writers Project, records. After emancipation, the practice carried on. You heated the pot from the night before, crumbled yesterday's cornbread into a bowl, poured the hot liquid over it, and let the bread swell into something between soup and porridge. The nutrition was real. Iron and folate from the greens, protein from the pork, the slow fuel of cornmeal, and it cost nothing beyond what supper had already spent. Most people living alone today have never heard of starting the morning this way. The pots went first, and then the knowledge went with them. The cast iron stove was never just for cooking, and every black grandmother in the 1960s understood this without having to say so. You started a pot of beans in the morning, not only because the family needed to eat, but because the stove needed to be burning. And a burning stove meant a warm kitchen, and a warm kitchen meant the whole back half of the house climbed a few degrees by noon. Women managing households on tight budgets in cities like Detroit and Cleveland had worked out a thermal logic no engineering firm had put on paper. Cook hot all day, keep the burners low but constant. Never let the stove go cold until everyone was in bed. Cast iron held heat long after the flame dropped. Turn the burner off at 9 and it was still radiating at midnight. What's been lost is not the knowledge exactly. It's the understanding that the stove was doing two jobs at once. She knew. She just never explained it because you were supposed to pick it up by being present. She used to start the neck bones Saturday afternoon so they'd be ready for Sunday dinner. Smoked neck bone and rice wasn't something you rushed. The bones needed hours to release the smoke, the collagen, the fat that turned the cooking liquid into something that coated each grain like gravy. In the 1950s, smoked neck bones were what the butcher had left after the better cuts sold. Black families bought them for almost nothing and turned them into the centerpiece of a winter table. The rice went in toward the end, absorbing broth until every grain carried that full peppery weight. In households that came north during the Great Migration, this dish was a direct line back to kitchens left behind in Mississippi. After she passed, 3 of her daughters tried to make it her way. None of them could. Number 10, fried fish cakes transformed small catches and leftover fish into portable lunches that traveled well and satisfied hunger. Families near rivers or coastal waters caught small fish, boiled them tender, then mashed the flesh with cornmeal and seasoning before frying into patties. These cakes could be made from fish too small for proper meals, stretching modest catches into food for entire families. The cornmeal binder extended protein, while frying created a crust that protected the interior during transport. Workers carried fish cakes in lunch pails or wrapped in newspaper, eating them cold hours after cooking. Coastal Black communities perfected these recipes over generations, understanding that water provided free protein for those willing to fish. The cakes represented skill and survival, transforming minimal resources into real meals. Red velvet cake was the crown jewel of dessert tables at African American family reunions, its dramatic crimson layers revealed with each slice. Women mixed cocoa, buttermilk, vinegar, and red food coloring into tender batter, then baked it into layers stacked high with tangy cream cheese frosting. The cake's origin was disputed, but its place in Black Southern tradition was undeniable. No reunion was complete without one. The cream cheese frosting provided perfect contrast to the subtle chocolate flavor, while the color made every slice feel like celebration. Grandmothers guarded their recipes carefully, each claiming theirs was the original. Children stared at the towering cakes, knowing they'd wait until after the main meal for their pieces. Red velvet cake represented the understanding that celebration required beauty as well as taste. Neckbone stew represented the transformation of humble ingredients into something profoundly nourishing for grieving families. Butchers sold these bony cuts for almost nothing, yet patient simmering extracted rich marrow and tender meat that fell away at a fork's touch. Church ladies browned the bones first, building fawn before adding onions, carrots, potatoes, and whatever root vegetables the season provided. Hours of gentle cooking turned tough connective tissue into silky richness. The broth alone could revive spirits dulled by exhaustion. Children and elders alike could eat this without difficulty, the meat so tender it required no effort. Widows received this knowing it would sustain them through days when cooking felt impossible. This was food made by hands that understood loss. Cast iron lid, steam trick, guaranteed chicken cooked through without burning the crust or leaving insides dangerously raw. Grandmothers learned that hot grease alone could deceive, browning outside while meat near the bone stayed pink. After chicken fried golden on both sides, the heavy lid was placed over the skillet and heat lowered. Steam built up, cooking pieces gently from all directions. The moisture kept crust from drying while trapped heat finished the job. After 10 minutes, the lid came off and heat went back up to re-crisp the coating. This two-stage method meant the thickest thighs and drumsticks were safe without sacrificing crunch. Grandmothers timed this by instinct, knowing exactly when to remove the lid before crust turned soft and lost its signature shatter. Onion sandwiches were poverty meals requiring nothing more than bread, raw onion slices, and whatever fat was available for spreading. Families sliced onions thick, layered them between bread, spread with lard or bacon drippings, and packed them for lunches when nothing else was available. The onions provided nutrition and sharp flavor that made plain bread more interesting than eating it dry. During the Depression and other lean periods, onion sandwiches kept families fed when even pennies for other ingredients had disappeared. Children ate them without complaint because hunger taught appreciation for whatever appeared. The strong flavor meant that even thin onion slices could make bread taste like something rather than nothing. Adults understood these sandwiches represented temporary hardship rather than permanent condition. Smothered chicken and rice was Sunday dinner, magic, transforming tough chicken pieces into fork-tender meat swimming in rich onion gravy. Mothers would season chicken legs and thighs generously, brown them in hot oil, then remove them while sliced onions softened in the drippings. The chicken returned to the pot covered with those caramelized onions and enough water or broth to create steam. Hours of slow cooking later, the meat fell from the bone and the gravy had thickened into something silky and deeply savory. Rice was piled on plates first, then topped with chicken and generous ladles of that precious gravy. Children fought over the pieces, with the most onions clinging to them. This dish was love made visible, requiring time and attention that showed how much mothers cared. Fried number 22, pinto beans and hot water cornbread. A bag of dried pintos at the Piggly Wiggly cost 23 cents in 1965, and that bag was a week of suppers for a widow with a single coil. She soaked a cup overnight in a coffee mug, drained them in the morning, and set them to simmer with a ham hock end and a halved onion. By supper time, the pot smelled like the back of her mother's kitchen in Tennessee. While the beans cooked, she stirred a half cup of meal with boiling water and a spoon of grease, patted out 2 flat cornbread cakes, and crisped them in the bean pot juice. Beans over the bread, hot sauce on top. Supper for a quarter, number 24, chitlins, cleaned the night before a run. Chitlins were the cheapest pork a black household could buy in 1929, sold for almost nothing because white grocers considered them scrap. Porters' wives cleaned them at the kitchen sink the night before a run, boiling them with onion and red pepper until the smell drove the children out onto the back porch. The cooked chitlins were then packed cold in a small jar and wedged beside the cornbread in the tin pail. Porters ate them at the end of the second shift when the dining car was shut and the sleeper berths were quiet. A man from Mobile said his mother used to cook them with vinegar to cut the funk, and that was the version he carried north with him to Chicago. The meal was old country food riding on a brand new luxury train. The contradiction never bothered the men who ate it. Number 15, souse meat on saltine crackers. Souse, also called hog head cheese, was the breakfast meat of working people who could not afford bacon. A hog's head got simmered for hours with vinegar, peppers, and salt. Then the cooked meat was packed tight into a loaf pan and chilled until it sliced like jelly. 2 cold slices on a stack of saltine crackers made a breakfast that was salty, tangy, and filling enough for a morning shift. A small loaf cost about 35 cents in a black neighborhood grocery, and it lasted 4 to 5 mornings if the family was careful with the slicing. Stewed apple slices with cinnamon on toasted bread required nothing more than 1 apple, a small pot, a half cup of water, a pinch of cinnamon, and a piece of bread, and produced something that tasted like it had taken all morning. She cored and sliced the apple thin, dropped the slices into the pot with water and cinnamon and a spoon of sugar, covered it, and let it go on low heat for 4 minutes while the bread toasted. By the time the toast was done, the apple had softened and turned translucent at the edges, and the cooking water had thickened from the fruit's natural pectin into something closer to a thin syrup. She spooned the apple directly onto the toast and ate it with a fork. This was how Depression-era black grandmothers created something that felt like a treat without spending. Anything the pantry didn't already hold, coaxing sweetness out of one piece of fruit the same way they coax flavor out of everything else. A plain apple, a little heat, something worth sitting down for. Peanut butter spread on a scratch biscuit was a breakfast with 2 layers of history in it. The biscuit, flour, lard, buttermilk, salt, just enough baking powder to raise it, had been on African American morning tables since before the Civil War, shaped by hands that knew the dough by feel, not measurement. The peanut butter carried older roots, tracing back to West African groundnut traditions that arrived in the memories of enslaved people long before the commercial jar existed. By the Depression years, the Bureau of Home Economics was promoting peanut butter as a protein substitute for meat-struggling families could no longer afford, and in black households that had been stretching protein for generations, it needed no advertisement. A jar cost a few cents and lasted the week. 2 biscuits spread thick held a person through the morning without complaint. The biscuits were made in a batch on Sunday and eaten through Wednesday. Nobody from those kitchens ever needed to be told what to do with a stale biscuit. Before anyone used the phrase thermal curtain, black grandmothers in the 1960s had already invented the concept with whatever heavy fabric came to hand. Wool blankets tacked above the window frame and let hang to the floor. Velvet curtains doubled over to trap a pocket of still air against the glass. Old coats draped across exterior windowsills when the cold settled in hard. The principle was sound. Moving air carries heat away from a surface fast, and still air trapped in folds of heavy fabric insulates against that transfer. A single layer of curtain fabric against a drafty window could reduce heat loss through that pane by 30%, and a double layer did better still. What your grandmother hung in those windows was not decoration. It was calculation, an understanding of cold and cloth and the way heat behaves when you give it nowhere to escape. She couldn't tell you the R value of a wool blanket, but she could tell you which window needed 2 layers and which could get by with 1. Chitterling stew with potatoes was the winter variation that even chitlin lovers sometimes didn't know about. Instead of frying or boiling them plain, some cooks cut the clean chitterlings small and simmered them with cubed potatoes, onions, and red pepper flakes until everything melded into a thick, savory stew. The potatoes absorbed the intense flavor, softening it, making it accessible even to people who usually push chitlins aside. In the 1950s and 60s, this stew showed up across the Deep South and the Great Migration cities, Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, usually around Christmas and New Year's when fresh chitterlings were available from the hog killing. The cleaning was the hardest part, hours of rinsing, scrubbing, soaking in vinegar water before a single piece went near the pot. That labor was always done by the same person in the house. When that person was gone, the stew often went with them because nobody else had the patience for the preparation. Number 5, souse loaf with crackers. Souse was a chilled meatloaf made from the head of a hog, the tongue, the ears, and any scraps the butcher wouldn't sell to white customers. A whole hog's head cost $0.25 in 1953. Your grandmother could make 4 pounds of souse from one head. She boiled the head all day with vinegar, salt, black pepper, sage, and a single dried red pepper. By evening, the meat fell off the bones like rain off a tin roof. She picked it clean by hand on the back porch while the broth reduced on the stove. She mixed the meat back into the reduced broth, poured the whole thing into a loaf pan, and set it on the cold cellar floor overnight. By morning, it had set into a firm jelly loaf, flecked with pink and white meat. She sliced it thin onto saltine crackers for an evening supper that fed 8 people for less than 50 cents. Your great aunt swore by it. Potato salad was as essential to reunions as the relatives themselves, with every matriarch claiming her version was definitive. Women boiled pounds of potatoes until just tender, then diced them while still warm so they absorbed the dressing better. The mixture combined mayonnaise, mustard, chopped celery, onion, and hard-boiled eggs with sweet pickle relish, adding brightness. The salad had to rest overnight, allowing flavors to marry into something greater than its parts. Served cold in massive bowls, it provided cool relief alongside smoky barbecued meats. Potatoes were dirt cheap, stretching to feed dozens from just a few pounds. Potato salad proved that simple ingredients handled with care created dishes people requested by name for years. Potato salad with boiled eggs caused quiet competition among church women, each convinced her version was superior. Russet potatoes were boiled just tender, cubed and dressed while warm so they absorbed the mayonnaise mixture completely. Boiled eggs added richness, their yolks crumbling into dressing to create creamy pockets throughout. Some added sweet pickle relish, others insisted on dill. Celery provided crunch, while paprika dusted across the top announced care with presentation. This salad stretched expensive ingredients into portions feeding crowds. Children requested seconds, finding comfort in familiar creaminess during confusing days of adult tears. The woman who made the best potato salad earned reputation that extended far beyond church kitchen walls. Lard and bacon grease blend gave fried chicken deep, savory richness that vegetable oil could never match. Grandmothers kept coffee, cans on the stove filled with rendered bacon fat saved from every breakfast. When frying day came, that precious grease was combined with fresh lard from the butcher or rendered at home from pork trimmings. The mixture created frying fat with a higher smoke point, but all the smoky, salty flavor baked into every piece. Chicken emerged with golden crust that tasted of Sunday mornings. Using this fat meant nothing was wasted, and grease could be strained and reused several times. Grandmothers knew exactly when the grease was spent, judging by color and smell alone. This was cooking by feel rather than thermometers, producing chicken that could not be replicated any other way. Syrup sandwiches were among the most iconic survival lunches in African American households, requiring nothing more than bread and thick molasses or sorghum. Families spread dark syrup generously between slices of whatever bread was available, creating a meal that was sweet, filling, and cost almost nothing. The syrup provided quick energy through natural sugars, while bread offered carbohydrates to sustain workers and children through long hours. In rural southern communities, sorghum was often homemade from stalks grown in family gardens, making this lunch essentially free. Children carried these sandwiches to school wrapped in cloth, eating them at midday without shame because everyone understood survival. The sweetness masked what was essentially poverty, transforming scarcity into something children actually looked forward to eating. Tomato rice carried the bright tang of canned tomatoes mixed into fluffy grains, a dish that children either loved immediately or grew to crave. Mothers would saute onions in bacon grease until soft, then add canned tomatoes and let them break down into a fragrant sauce. Rice was stirred in and cooked slowly, absorbing every drop of that tangy, sweet liquid until each grain turned a beautiful sunset orange. Some families added sugar to balance acidity, while others preferred natural sharpness that cut through heavier dishes. It was often served alongside fried fish or pork chops, but children happily ate bowls of it alone. Tomato rice was inexpensive, using pantry staples that cost pennies but delivered comfort worth far more. This dish taught children that simple ingredients created memorable meals. Number 19, the hot plate itself. The single burner hot plate has its own history, and it is worth telling because that little coil shaped how a whole generation of Black seniors ate alone. The first electric hot plates rolled out of factories in the early 1920s, sold by Sears Roebuck for around $4, but they did not reach poor and Black households in any real number until after World War II, when surplus Army models hit the secondhand stores along Lenox Avenue and South Parkway for $2.50. By the late 1950s, rooming houses across the country, from Harlem to Houston to East St. Louis to North Philadelphia, banned full kitchens to cut their fire insurance bills in half. Landlords allowed exactly one hot plate per tenant, sometimes chained to the table leg with a length of bicycle cable so it could not walk off in the night. The Westinghouse 500-watt model, with its black bakelite handle and its single chrome dial that turned from low to high with a satisfying click, became the workhorse of senior survival across the urban North. By 1968, Black widows living on Social Security checks of around $55 a month were stretching $12 weekly food allotments across one coil, one kettle, and one well-seasoned iron skillet. The Great Migration delivered millions of Black seniors into northern cities where they aged in single rented rooms with no stove, no oven, no refrigerator beyond a small icebox in the hallway. The hot plate was not a convenience. It was a kitchen, a memory keeper, and a quiet partner at the table. The part that surprised me going back through old housing surveys from Chicago and Detroit is how many obituaries from the 1970s mentioned that the deceased had cooked their last 40 years of suppers on a single coil that fit in a shoebox. One burner, 100 recipes, a whole way of living kept warm by a glow no bigger than a saucer. Number 27, red beans reheated 3 times. New Orleans porters carried red beans the way Chicago porters carried cornbread. A pot cooked on Sunday with a smoked ham bone fed a family Monday, then traveled with the porter Tuesday in a small enamel cup wedged inside the tin pail. Red beans cost about 8 cents a pound at the corner grocery in 1932, and a single pound fed a household of 6 on Monday and the porter for 2 more days. The beans were reheated on the stove in the porter's quarters, and the flavor deepened every time the cup hit the heat. By the second reheat, the pork bone had given up everything it had. By the third, the beans were almost a paste, eaten with a spoon over a folded napkin. Porters from Louisiana said the third reheat was the best one. The first 2 were just rehearsal. Number 18, Strico lean and red-eye gravy. Few breakfasts spoke louder about Black Southern survival than a thin slice of Strico lean with a pour of red-eye gravy on top. Strico lean was the cheap cousin of bacon, a piece of side meat with stripes of pink running through the fat. It cost half what bacon cost in 1965, sometimes only 15 cents a pound at a country store. 2 slices went into a hot pan and curled up tight as they crisped, leaving a thin layer of brown drippings stuck to the bottom. A half cup of strong black coffee poured straight into that hot pan, and the brown bits lifted off the iron in seconds. That dark, salty pour was the red-eye gravy. It went over a split biscuit or a wedge of cornbread, and the streak of lean sat right on top. The flavor was bigger than the price, and most older folks today still remember the smell of coffee hitting that pan first thing in the morning. For many of us, that one pour of red-eye gravy is the closest thing our grandmothers ever left behind to a written recipe. A fried egg on white bread with hot sauce proved a Black grandmother living alone had everything she needed, because she knew exactly what to do with 2 ingredients and a hot skillet in under 5 minutes. She cracked the egg into a thin slick of bacon grease, covered it with a saucer, never a lid, always a saucer, and let the steam finish the white without flipping. The yolk stayed intact and runny. When she slid it onto plain white bread and hit it with 3 shakes of Louisiana hot sauce, she had a complete protein breakfast that held her past noon. The saucer was the secret. Most people flipped the egg and killed the yolk, or left it uncovered and the white stayed wet on top. The steam method took 2 minutes flat and was never written down in any kitchen, anywhere. It was passed through watching, not words. Crystal and Louisiana brands were the trusted names. Now she's gone, and someone else lives in that kitchen, and they use a lid. Egg went in last, and you had to know when. If the grits had stopped bubbling but were still steaming, that was the moment. You pressed it well into the center with the back of a spoon, cracked the egg directly in, covered the pot, and let the heat finish it. This was not a recipe from a card. It was knowledge held in hands that had been stretching a meal for generations, producing a full breakfast from 2 ingredients that cost less than a dime in the 1950s. Grits are among the oldest foods in African American kitchens, ground from hominy corn using Native American nixtamalization, a process that unlocks nutrients plain grinding cannot release, and carried through Southern cooking from plantation quarters to city apartments. 1 pot, 1 flame, 1 dish, to wash. For a woman living alone after her children had gone north, that economy mattered. The yolk broke when you pressed it and spread through the grits like a slow yellow sauce. Nobody makes it that way anymore. The plastic sheeting kit was not glamorous. It came in a roll you could buy at the hardware store for under $1. You cut it to size and tacked it against the window frame with strips of cardboard or straight pins, pulling it taut enough to create a sealed layer of still air between the plastic and the glass. That thin layer functioned like a second pane. Cold couldn't conduct through still air the way it conducted through glass, and the result was a window that let in the same light, but stopped a measurable share of the heat loss. The Philadelphia Tribune documented this as a common fixture in Black households throughout the 1960s, noting window kits were among the most widely used insulation methods in red-line neighborhoods where landlords had no legal obligation to maintain adequate heating. The plastic fogged and yellowed by February. You replaced it in October. It was the closest thing to a storm window most of these families ever had. When the root cellar was the only grocery store that mattered, turnip root and green stew kept households fed through the lean months. The whole plant went into the pot. Dense white root, chopped rough, bitter greens, torn by hand and added later so they wouldn't cook to nothing. A piece of smoked jowl sat at the bottom, giving up salt and fat as it simmered. Turnips grew in poor soil when nothing else would, and they stored for months underground. By the 1950s, most Black families in the Deep South kept a row of turnips specifically for winter eating. The stew was better the second day after the flavors settled and the broth thickened overnight. You reheated it slow, and the kitchen filled with that earthy, peppery smell that said somebody here still cooked from the ground up. Number 23, cornmeal mush with molasses. A 2-pound bag of yellow cornmeal cost 19 cents at the Piggly Wiggly in 1956. A quart of dark molasses ran 35 cents and lasted a family of 9 the better part of a month. Your grandmother boiled water on the wood stove, salted it, and rained the cornmeal in through her fingers like sand through a sieve while she stirred with a long-handled wooden spoon. You'd see the mush thicken up in 8 minutes flat. It pulled away from the sides of the pot like dough from a bowl. She spooned it hot into chipped enamel bowls, made a small well in the middle of each, and poured a slow stream of molasses into the well. The children stirred the dark sweetness through the yellow until the whole bowl turned the color of a fall leaf. This was supper on a Wednesday in February. Meat was gone. Payday was Friday. It worked. Nobody went to school hungry. Deviled eggs appeared on every reunion table, their golden yellow filling piped neatly into white halves that disappeared within minutes. Women boiled dozens of eggs the night before, carefully peeling and slicing each one to remove the yolk for mashing. The filling combined yolks with mayonnaise, mustard, pickle juice, and paprika until smooth and tangy. Each half was topped with a sprinkle of paprika for color. Eggs cost almost nothing, yet these transformed versions looked elegant on serving platters lined with lettuce leaves. Children circled the table waiting for permission to grab one, while adults debated whose recipe was superior. Deviled eggs represented the art of making something fancy from humble ingredients. They traveled well and could be made days ahead without losing quality. Peach cobbler arrived at funeral repasts in deep baking dishes, the fruit bubbling beneath golden crusts that shattered at the touch of a spoon. During summer, fresh peaches were sliced and sugared until their juices ran. In winter, home-canned fruit provided the same comfort. The topping varied by cook. Some preferred biscuit dough dropped in mounds, others rolled pastry laid across the top. Butter dotted throughout melted into the fruit, creating richness that balanced the peach's tartness. This was the dessert that caused the most requests for seconds, its warmth and sweetness providing comfort that savory dishes could not match. Served in fellowship halls, still slightly warm from the oven, cobbler reminded mourners of summer abundance even during seasons of loss. The cost remained low, requiring only fruit, flour, sugar, and butter. Double dip coating method built crust thick enough to stay crispy even after sitting in a basket for hours. Grandmothers who sold chicken at church fundraisers knew thin coatings would turn soggy. After the first shake in seasoned flour, chicken went back into buttermilk and then into flour again. This double layer created tiny air pockets that fried extra crunchy while insulating meat from drying out. Some grandmothers did 3 dips for the thickest possible shell. Each layer had to dry slightly before the next, requiring patience and counter space lined with newspaper. The finished pieces looked almost battered rather than simply coated, with ridges and peaks that turned dark gold in hot grease. This was fried chicken meant to impress and last through long Sunday afternoons. Bean sandwiches turned leftover pinto or navy beans into portable lunches that provided complete protein. Families mashed cooked beans with a fork, seasoned them with salt, pepper, and whatever hot sauce was available, then spread them between bread slices. The beans had often been cooked with ham hocks or fatback, carrying those flavors into the sandwich. This lunch cost almost nothing because dried beans were among the cheapest foods available, and leftovers stretched Sunday dinner into Monday lunch. Children carried these to school while adults took them to factories and fields. The texture was soft and filling, each bite delivering the earthy richness of slow-cooked beans. Bean sandwiches represented the practical genius of Black kitchens where nothing was ever discarded. Dirty rice earned its name from the ground meat and chicken livers that gave it a speckled, earthy appearance no child could resist. Mothers would brown ground beef or pork with finely chopped livers, onions, celery, and bell peppers until the mixture was deeply savory. Rice was cooked separately, then folded into the meat mixture with Cajun seasonings that brought gentle heat and bold flavor. The dish stretched a small amount of meat across a large pot, making it economical enough for weekly suppers. Children who claimed to hate liver never suspected it was hidden in every delicious bite, and mothers kept that secret with knowing smiles. Dirty rice was Cajun tradition, adopted and adapted by Black families throughout Louisiana and beyond. It proved that the best flavors often came from the humblest ingredients. Number 27, liver and onions on the coil. Beef liver was the cheapest cut on the butcher's tray in the 1960s, often 2 slices for 30 cents, and a senior with a hot plate could turn it into a meal that tasted like a holiday. She salted a thin slice, dredged it in flour from a paper sack, and laid it in a hot pan with a tablespoon of lard. Sliced yellow onion went in beside it and softened to gold while the liver browned on one side. The whole thing finished in under 8 minutes on that single coil, iron-rich, deep-flavored, and gentle on a senior's worn-out teeth. Pullman porters used to order this in railroad diners, and Black grandmothers cooked it on Tuesdays because Tuesday was the day the doctor said your blood needed it. Number 29, hoe cakes cooked on the vestibule stove. When the dining car shut for the night, porters slipped down to the coal stove that heated the vestibule and dropped a spoon of cornmeal batter onto the hot iron lid. Hoe cakes were field food brought north by their fathers from Mississippi and Alabama, and they cost almost nothing. A cup of meal, a pinch of soda, water from the porter's washroom tap. The smell carried into the sleeper berths, and white passengers would sometimes ask what was cooking. Porters always said nothing. By the time the train hit St. Louis, the hoe cakes were folded into a handkerchief and eaten standing up. They were the closest thing a working man had to home cooking between Chicago and New Orleans. Number 23, hot water cornbread for breakfast. When the flour ran out before payday, a quick patty of hot water cornbread filled the gap, and almost every soul food kitchen leaned on this trick. The method had only 3 things in it: cornmeal, a little salt, and boiling water poured straight from the kettle. The mix went stiff in the bowl, then a wet hand patted it into rounds the size of a saucer, and those rounds dropped into a 1/4 inch of hot lard. 3 minutes aside and breakfast was on the table. Working women in Detroit and Cleveland kept a coffee can of cornmeal next to the stove for exactly this reason. It cost almost nothing, it filled up a grown man, and it took less than 10 minutes from start to finish. The patties were often eaten torn open with a spoonful of pot liquor saved from the night before. Peanut butter on toast with a smear of leftover bacon drippings sounds like an accident, but in black kitchens from the 1930s through the 60s, it was a calculated decision by women who understood how to build a filling breakfast out of almost nothing. Peanut butter sold for roughly 10 cents a pound during the Depression and promoted nationwide by the Bureau of Home Economics as a cheap protein source after World War I, became a staple in African American pantries when meat was unaffordable. The dripping tin sat open on the counter, and spreading a thin layer across the peanut butter toast was natural. The salt cut through the sweetness, the fat extended the staying power. The whole thing came together in under 3 minutes. Together they kept you full until afternoon, and fullness was the point on mornings when work started before sunrise and lunch wasn't guaranteed until 2. Nobody planned it the first time. You did it because both things were there and it worked, and you never stopped. The dripping tin was always on the counter. Now nobody keeps a dripping tin. The grease tin sat on the back of the stove, and everyone knew not to touch it without a reason. Bacon grease was saved after every frying, poured through a strainer into a metal can, kept at room temperature, used for seasoning cast iron, starting gravy, and frying the next morning's bread. On mornings when the pantry was light, it went onto a slice of bread. You spread it right to the edges, either ate it cold with coffee or ran it under the broiler until the fat melted in and the edges crisped. Either way, it tasted rich and smoky in a way bread only tastes when animal fat has entered it. Saving bacon grease was not just frugality, it was a philosophy. Nothing in the African American kitchen was more fundamental than the idea that what was rendered from the hog belonged to the cook and would be honored by using every last drop. That practice is nearly gone. She knew its value without ever naming it. Before anyone used the phrase thermal curtain, Black grandmothers in the 1960s had already invented the concept with whatever heavy fabric came to hand. Wool blankets tacked above the window frame and let hang to the floor. Velvet curtains doubled over to trap a pocket of still air against the glass. Old coats draped across exterior windowsills when the cold settled in hard. The principle was sound. Moving air carries heat away from a surface fast, and still air trapped in folds of heavy fabric insulates against that transfer. A single layer of curtain fabric against a drafty window could reduce heat loss through that pane by 30%, and a double layer did better still. What your grandmother hung in those windows was not decoration. It was calculation, an understanding of cold and cloth and the way heat behaves when you give it nowhere to escape. She couldn't tell you the R value of a wool blanket, but she could tell you which window needed 2 layers and which could get by with 1. In the 1940s and 50s, Streaker lean and biscuits was the breakfast that got a man out the door and into the cold without complaining. Streak-o-lean, a specific cut of salt-cured fatback with thin ribbons of meat running through the fat, was sliced paper thin and fried in a dry skillet until it curled and crisped at the edges. The rendered fat stayed in the pan, and into it went a splash of black coffee to make red-eye gravy, dark, salty, slightly bitter, and unlike anything you've tasted if you didn't grow up with it. The biscuits were split open hot and laid face down in the gravy until they soaked it up. This was survival food, dense with calories for men heading to the fields or the factory floor when the temperature hadn't climbed above freezing. The cut itself has nearly vanished from butcher counters, replaced by prepackaged bacon that doesn't render the same way or carry the same depth of smoke and salt. Nobody asks for streak-o-lean anymore. Most butchers under 60 wouldn't know what you meant. Number 7, oxtail stew. Oxtails were the cheapest cut at the butcher counter for decades, often less than 50 cents a pound because most people did not know what to do with them. Black women who cooked Sunday dinner did. A woman in Savannah, Georgia, seasoned oxtail pieces with salt, pepper, garlic, and onion powder, then browned them in a heavy pot until the outside was dark and caramelized. She added water, onions, carrots, and potatoes, then let the whole thing simmer for 4 hours while the family was at church. By the time everyone came home, the meat was falling off the bone and the broth had turned into a thick, rich gravy. Oxtails were a staple of Sunday dinner in Black households because they were cheap and they rewarded patience. You could not rush them. You could not shortcut them. You had to give them time, and in return, they gave your table one of the most deeply flavored meals any kitchen ever produced. Today, oxtails cost $8 to $12 a pound. The women who made them affordable are gone. Macaroni salad appeared in giant bowls at family reunions, its creamy coolness providing relief from summer heat and rich barbecued meats. Women boiled pounds of elbow macaroni, then folded it with mayonnaise, mustard, diced celery, onion, and hard-boiled eggs until every noodle was coated. Some families added sweet pickle relish, while others preferred chopped bell peppers for color and crunch. The salad had to rest overnight, allowing flavors to meld and noodles to absorb the creamy coating. Children piled it onto their plates alongside barbecue, appreciating its mild flavor compared to spicier dishes. A few boxes of pasta and pantry condiments could feed an entire reunion crowd economically. Macaroni salad represented the genius of stretching affordable ingredients into crowd-pleasing abundance. Rice and giblet gravy stretched precious poultry into portions feeding crowds. The organ meats simmered into rich brown sauce poured over fluffy white rice. Giblets, hearts, livers, gizzards, and necks cost almost nothing yet delivered intense flavor when chopped and cooked slowly with onions and flour. The gravy turned dark and savory, each spoonful containing bits of tender organ meat. This dish appeared at nearly every funeral repast because rice was cheap and filling, while giblets came free with every chicken purchased for frying. Church women made gallons of this gravy, knowing it would disappear quickly as mourners sought comfort in its familiar richness. Children who wrinkled noses at the idea of organs ate this gravy without complaint, the meat chopped fine enough to pass unnoticed. This was practical cooking that wasted nothing. Brown paper bag shake kept kitchens clean and chicken perfectly crusted without fancy equipment. Grandmothers saved grocery bags, knowing the rough interior helped flour cling while containing the mess. Seasoned flour went in first, mixed with salt, pepper, paprika, and secret family spices. Buttermilk-soaked pieces were dropped in 2 at a time, the top folded shut, then shaken until covered. The motion had to be vigorous but controlled. Children often helped with shaking, learning rhythm that would become their own technique. The paper absorbed excess moisture while flour adhered in layers that fried up golden. This method used less flour than dredging in bowls, stretching resources when money was tight. When the bag got too damp, a fresh one took its place. That simple bag became legendary in black kitchens everywhere. Cold biscuits with preserves provided sweet lunches made from breakfast leftovers and home canned fruit. Families baked biscuits in the morning, setting aside extras for midday meals. These were split and spread with whatever preserves the pantry held, often blackberry, peach, or fig jam made from fruit gathered in season. The biscuits were denser cold than fresh, but preserves added moisture and sweetness that made them satisfying. Children carried these, wrapped in cloth, eating them at school while dreaming of summer days spent picking berries. The preserves represented hours of labor, harvesting and canning fruit that would otherwise rot. Together, biscuit and jam cost almost nothing, but delivered comfort that felt like abundance. This lunch connected daily sustenance to seasonal rhythms. Rice pudding for breakfast was a sweet morning treat that turned last night's leftover rice into something children woke up excited to eat. Mothers would warm the rice in a pot with milk, sugar, cinnamon, and a touch of vanilla until it became creamy and fragrant. Some added raisins or a pat of butter, stirring until everything melted together into comfort. The pudding was served warm in bowls, sometimes with an extra drizzle of condensed milk for families who could afford the luxury. Children loved that something as ordinary as leftover rice could be transformed into dessert they were allowed to eat before school. This dish embodied the African American philosophy of wasting nothing and finding joy in reinvention. It was practical magic, turning yesterday's side dish into today's beloved breakfast. Number 24, 3-night chicken neck broth. Here is the supper from the intro, the one that stretched a single chicken neck into 3 nights of broth. The butcher on Hastings Street in Detroit sold a bag of necks for 29 cents in 1969, but one neck alone could feed a widow for half a week if she knew the trick. She covered a single neck with 3 cups of water on the hot plate, dropped in a stub of celery, half an onion, and a pinch of poultry seasoning. She let it murmur for 40 minutes, then pulled the neck out and saved it in a saucer in the icebox. Monday night, she ladled the broth over crumbled cornbread. Tuesday, she boiled rice in what was left and called it dinner. Wednesday, she shredded the meat off the neck bone, dropped it back into the last cup of broth with a little flour gravy, and ate it over toast. 3 nights, 1 neck, 29 cents. That coil did the work 3 grown men in a kitchen could not. Number 20, skillet cornbread, fried in a coffee tin. This is the meal porters fried in a coffee tin when the dining car ran dry. By 1933, the Depression had cut Pullman's dining stocks thin, and on the long southern runs, the chefs sometimes ran out of food for the help by the second night. Porters who knew their way around the coal stove would empty a battered Maxwell House tin, oil the inside with a smear of bacon grease pulled from the morning rags, and drop a handful of cornmeal batter mixed with water from the washroom. The tin sat on the iron lid until the batter set into a thick, ragged cake. Porters cut it with a pocket knife and shared it between 2 men standing in the vestibule, the wind from the open Dutch door cooling their faces. It was hobo food cooked by men in white jackets, a meal invented inside a 400-hour month. Number 7, fried bologna with cane syrup. A thick cut slice of bologna, fried until the edges curled into a cup, then drizzled with cane syrup, was the breakfast of black children all across the urban South in the 1960s. The trick was the cut at the edge. Two small slits cut into the rim of each slice kept it from puffing up in the middle so it crisped flat in the hot grease. A quarter pound of bologna ran about 15 cents at the corner store, enough for 4 hungry kids. The slices fried in their own fat, no extra grease needed, and came out shiny dark brown with crisp, lacy edges. The syrup hit the hot meat and turned into a thin glaze that ran down onto the plate. Most working mothers in Houston, New Orleans, and Jacksonville sent kids out the door with this breakfast at least once a week. It was hot, it was sweet, it was salty, and it lasted them through the morning at school without a single complaint about the cost. Buckwheat pancakes made one at a time on a dry cast iron skillet, drizzled with sorghum molasses and folded in half. This was the breakfast black grandmothers made when they wanted something that felt like a full meal without the production of a Sunday morning. Buckwheat flour thrived in poor soil and cost far less than wheat flour through the Depression years, making it a regular staple in African American farm kitchens across the 1930s and 40s. The batter was mixed in a single bowl: buckwheat, a pinch of salt, buttermilk, 1 egg, a half teaspoon of baking soda, and poured directly onto a skillet that had been heating dry. The dry heat method was the insider knowledge. Buckwheat's natural oils released clean from ungreased iron, and grease in the pan made the edges greasy instead of crisp. You watched for the bubbles to stop moving across the surface and flipped once. Fold it around a line of sorghum, eat it at the stove. Done in 4 minutes. Nobody taught that in words. You stood next to her until you knew it. But before the boxed things arrived, there was crackling bread, cornbread baked with bits of rendered pork skin folded directly into the batter, the same skin cooked down in a cast iron pot until it crisped into small, brown, intensely savory cracklings. You mixed them into cornmeal, water, salt, and soda, baked the whole thing in a heavy skillet, and what came out was dense, rich, and crackling studded, with a bottom crust nobody who grew up eating it ever forgot. Sorghum syrup finished it, and sorghum carried African roots, brought to the American South from West Africa in the early 17th century, where it was called Guinea corn and had been used as a primary sweetener and grain staple for generations before the first enslaved person reached this shore. Crackling bread cost almost nothing when the hog had already been rendered. You used what the butchering left behind. It disappeared when hog rendering days ended and the cracklings went with them. The last woman who made it right held knowledge about cast iron and rendered fat that has never been written down. Stuffing newspaper and rags into window cracks was the first defense in almost every black household that couldn't afford a landlord who fixed things. The technique had to be done right, crumpled, not flat, because flat newspaper just shifted and let the cold through. You packed it tight into the gap between the frame and the sill, then pressed a strip of old flannel over the top so the draft couldn't work the paper loose overnight. In the 1960s, newspaper cost almost nothing, and multiple layers of newsprint trapped a thin air pocket that slowed heat loss measurably. The same principle behind modern insulated wall panels, but without the price tag. The Chicago Defender, the Pittsburgh Courier, the Call and Post out of Cleveland, those papers did double duty. They told you what was happening in the world, then they kept the cold out of your bedroom. You didn't throw them away. You read them and then you put them to work. Nobody taught this in a class. You watched your grandmother do it on the first cold night of October, and after that you knew. The smell of peanut soup could stop you in the hallway before you even reached the kitchen. Roasted peanuts, ground smooth, simmered in broth with onion and a pinch of red pepper, thickened until the spoon stood up in the pot. This dish carried roots straight from West Africa, where groundnut stews had fed families for centuries before the first ships crossed the Atlantic. In Virginia's Tidewater region, peanut soup became a winter staple in black households by the 1930s, long before George Washington Carver made the peanut famous for other reasons. The soup cost almost nothing: a handful of peanuts, some water, whatever scraps of celery or onion were around, but the flavor was enormous, creamy, and warm with a slow heat underneath that didn't announce itself until the second spoonful. Kids who grew up on it could identify it from 3 rooms away, and every family had their own ratio: more salt here, a little cayenne there, measured by hand, never written down. You asked for the recipe, they'd laugh and pour you another bowl. Number 19, Hoppin' John. A pound of dry black-eyed peas cost 11 cents at the country store in St. Helena, Parish, Louisiana, in 1952. A scoop of long-grain rice from a burlap sack ran another 6 cents. A smoked ham hock from the meat counter cost a quarter and flavored a pot that fed 12 people. Your grandmother soaked the peas overnight in a chipped enamel basin on the back step. By sunrise, they'd swollen to fill the basin like sponges in water. She drained them, dropped them into the heavy black pot with the ham hock, and covered the whole thing with cold well water. The pot went on the wood stove at 6 in the morning. It stayed there, simmering low, until the church bell rang at noon. Then the rice went in, scoop after scoop, until the peas and the rice met somewhere in the middle and the broth turned the color of pecan shells. She seasoned it with salt, black pepper, and a single dried red pepper she'd hung from the rafters in October. Hoppin' John on New Year's Day was a prayer for the year ahead. Hoppin' John on a Tuesday was just supper. What most people miss is that this dish carried memory the way a hymn carries melody. The peas were brought across the ocean by people who lost almost everything but kept this one bean. The rice came up from the Carolina Low Country on a steamboat in a great-great-grandfather's pocket. The ham hock was the only piece of the hog the white farmer would sell to a black family without an argument. Your grandmother put all 3 in one pot because that was what her own grandmother had done in 1898 and 1872, and far earlier in a slave cabin behind the big house, where the cruelty was the rule and the supper was the resistance, year after year, generation after generation. 12 people ate from one pot for under $1. Nobody got up hungry. Nobody ever has. Your kin ate this for the same reason yours might tonight. Pickled beets brought vibrant color to reunion tables, their deep magenta hue staining everything they touched while delivering sweet and tangy flavor. Women canned them by the dozen in summer when beets were cheap, creating jewel-toned jars that lasted until reunion season. The beets were boiled tender, sliced thin, and packed into jars with hot vinegar brine, sweetened with sugar and spiced with cloves. Served cold alongside heavy meat dishes, they provided refreshing contrast that cleansed the palate between bites. Children learned early to be careful around the beet table, though purple-stained fingers became badges of reunion participation. The pickling process transformed affordable root vegetables into something elegant. Pickled beets represented forward-thinking preservation, summer's bounty captured in glass to brighten gatherings. Black-eyed pea salad appeared at summer funeral repasts when cold dishes provided relief from southern heat and heavy grief. Dried peas were simmered, tender but not mushy, drained and dressed while warm with vinegar, oil, diced onions, and bell peppers. The vinegar's sharpness cut through richness of fried meats, dominating most tables. This dish could be made days ahead and actually improved as it sat, flavors melding into something tangy. Church ladies appreciated its practicality. No reheating needed, no worry about spoilage in crowded halls, lacking refrigeration. The peas provided protein while vegetables added crunch and color to plates, otherwise brown and beige. Families recognized this as the work of experienced cooks who understood mourners needed balance. Onion salt finish was applied right when chicken came out of the grease, while the crust was still glistening and hot enough to absorb seasoning. Grandmothers kept a shaker of onion salt by the stove, dusting each piece as it landed on the draining rack. The heat activated the onion flavor, and the salt adhered to the oily surface, creating an extra layer of seasoning that hit the tongue immediately. This technique solved the problem of coating that tasted bland, despite careful seasoning of the flour. The finish was light but noticeable, adding complexity without overwhelming the chicken itself. Some grandmothers made their own onion salt by grinding dried onion flakes with coarse salt. The result was chicken that tasted fully seasoned from first bite to last, with no disappointing blank spots where flavor failed to reach. Souse meat sandwiches used the jellied pork that resulted from boiling pig feet, ears, and other scraps with vinegar and spices. The meat was picked from bones, mixed with natural gelatin, and pressed into loaves that could be sliced for sandwiches. The flavor was tangy and rich, the texture somewhere between firm and soft. Families made souse after hog killings, preserving parts that would otherwise go to waste. The vinegar acted as preservative, allowing the meat to last for weeks in cool cellars or ice boxes. Workers carried souse sandwiches, knowing the protein would sustain them through demanding labor. The taste was distinctive, not for everyone, but deeply satisfying for those who grew up eating it. Souse represented the nose-to-tail philosophy that defined Black foodways. Red rice with smoked sausage was the kind of dish that announced itself the moment you walked through the door, its tomato-rich aroma filling every corner of the kitchen. African American mothers learned this recipe from gulagishi traditions, where rice was king and nothing went to waste. Long grain rice was sautéed with onions, bell peppers, and garlic, then simmered in crushed tomatoes seasoned with paprika and cayenne. Sliced smoked sausage was stirred in during the final minutes, its rendered fat adding richness to every grain. The dish was economical and filling, stretching a single link of sausage across a pot that fed 6 children. Served straight from the cast iron skillet, this rice carried the warmth of Sunday afternoons. Children scraped their bowls clean, hoping for seconds before siblings could claim them. Number 28, stewed tomato and bread. By the time supper rolled around, a widow's pantry was often down to a can of Del Monte stewed tomatoes and the heel of a day-old loaf. She poured the 14-ounce can into a small saucepan on the coil, added a spoon of sugar to cut the tan taste, and dropped in 2 slices of torn-up white bread. The bread soaked up the broth and went soft like baby food. She finished it with a knob of margarine and a turn of black pepper from the shaker she had carried up from Arkansas in 1953. Working mothers in Birmingham fed this to teething babies and bedridden grandparents from the same chipped bowl. For a dime and a quiet 5 minutes, it was supper that knew how to stretch a single tin into something a senior could call dinner on a Wednesday night. Number 23, smoked sausage and cold grits. Smoked sausage was the porter's protein when payday was still 6 days away. Black butchers in St. Louis and Memphis sold links for around 12 cents a piece in the early 1930s, and a porter's wife would pan-fry 2 of them on Saturday night, let them cool, and slide them into the tin pail beside a small enamel cup of stiff grits. The grits set up overnight in the icebox and traveled like a brick, eaten cold with the spoon while the train climbed the grade out of Birmingham. By the time the porter reached the second leg of his run, the sausage had bled its grease into the grits and the meal was warm in the mouth, even though it was cold in the cup. It was poor food made smart. 3 working hours of food for the price of a streetcar fare. Number 13, hog jowl with black coffee. A single thin slice of smoked hog jowl with a cup of strong black coffee was the breakfast of men who had to be at the mill or the field by sunrise. The jowl came from the cheek of the pig and cost almost nothing because most white grocery stores did not want it. In a soul food household, it was treasured. 1 slice in a hot pan rendered into smoky brown grease and curled up crisp at the edges. The coffee, boiled in a battered enamel pot and poured strong enough to stand a spoon in, washed it down. There was no toast, no eggs, no fuss. Just meat, fat, and heat in the belly with the smell of wood smoke still in the cured pork. Black families in the Carolinas and Tennessee mountain country ate this 6 days a week through the winter, and grandmothers swore it was what kept the men working past sundown without sitting down once. Crackers and cane syrup was the breakfast that required nothing but a tin of Georgia cane syrup and whatever saltines were left in the house, and somehow it held you until noon. Back when a can of Steen's pure cane syrup cost less than a quarter and lasted a household most of the winter, Black grandmothers across Louisiana and the Deep South kept it on the table like a condiment, not just for biscuits, not just for cornbread, but for crackers when there was nothing else and time was short. You stacked them flat, drizzled the syrup in slow circles, and waited. The trick was the wait. 30 seconds too long, and they went limp. 30 seconds too short, and you were eating dry crackers with sticky fingers. Elders knew exactly when. By a feel, by the way, the syrup stopped moving. Nobody wrote that down. You learned it standing next to her. Now she's gone, and the tin is still on the shelf, and it just doesn't taste the same when you do it yourself. Crackers and cane syrup required almost no thought and almost no effort, and that was its value on a weekday morning when the stove wasn't warm. You laid out soda crackers on a plate and poured cane syrup over them in slow amber loops until each cracker pooled in sweetness, then ate them before they lost their snap. The whole pleasure was the contrast between the salt and the syrup's deep, dark sweetness. Cane syrup was a foundational pantry item in Black Southern households, made from sugar cane juice cooked down into a thick, richly flavored syrup, sweeter than molasses but less bitter, far cheaper than refined sugar, and lasting months without refrigeration. It stretched across dozens of breakfasts, sweetening biscuits, hoe cakes, and cornbread, the same way jam sweetened toast in households that could afford jam. On mornings when nothing else was ready, and every household had those mornings, crackers and cane syrup was the answer. It cost almost nothing. It got you out the door. If crackers and cane syrup asked nothing, rolling old towels and worn-out coats into a tight cylinder and pressing them against the bottom of the front door was so common in 1960s Black households that you almost didn't notice it anymore. It was just there, the way the rug was there or the coat hooks were there. A 1/4-inch gap under an exterior door in a Chicago winter could drop a room's temperature by 10 degrees overnight, and most of the row houses and tenements that Black seniors occupied had gaps like that because nobody was coming to fix them, and landlords in red-line neighborhoods counted on tenants not knowing their options. The draft snake was stationed at every door leading to the outside or to an unheated room. When the wind picked up, you could feel it pressing against the cloth from the other side. The coat you rolled up was always the one too warm to wear out anymore, so it kept working. Persimmon pudding depended on knowing exactly when to pick the fruit. Too early, and the tannins locked your mouth shut. Too late, and the birds had taken everything. The first hard frost was the signal. After a freeze, wild persimmons turned honey sweet, almost jammy, and the women who gathered them from fence lines and field edges knew which trees gave the best fruit the way they knew which neighbor kept the best garden. The pulp was pressed through a colander mixed with eggs, milk, flour, cinnamon, and nutmeg, then baked into a dense, dark pudding that tasted like autumn saved for winter. In the 1940s and 50s, persimmon pudding appeared at church suppers and holiday tables across rural Black communities, and the women who made it kept their tree location secret. The pudding faded when the trees came down for development and the women who picked them stopped walking those fence lines. Number 11, cornbread dressing. This was the dish that caused family arguments at Thanksgiving, but it appeared on Sunday tables all through the fall and winter. A woman in Macon, Georgia, made cornbread a day ahead, crumbled it by hand, and mixed it with celery, onion, sage, boiled eggs, and chicken broth from scratch. The proportion of bread to broth was the whole secret, and she knew it by the feel of the mixture in her hands. Too dry and it crumbled on your plate, too wet and it turned to mush. She squeezed a handful, and if it held together but still felt light, the ratio was right. No recipe could teach you that. It was knowledge that lived in a woman's fingers, passed from mother to daughter by standing side by side in the kitchen. The sage was the signature. Too much, and it tasted like medicine. Too little, and it tasted like wet bread. Her amount was perfect, and she could not have told you what it was. Watermelon rind pickles were a testament to the waste-nothing philosophy that defined African American cooking. After the sweet red flesh was eaten during hot reunion afternoons, the white and green rinds were saved and transformed into sweet, tangy pickles. Women soaked the rinds overnight in salt water to firm them, then simmered them in a syrup of vinegar, sugar, cinnamon, and cloves until translucent. The process took patience but cost nothing, since the rinds were kitchen scraps given new life. These pickles provided welcome contrast to heavy reunion foods, their sweet acidity cutting through plates of meat and gravy. Children often wrinkled their noses at first, but grew to love the unexpected sweetness hiding in those pale slices. Watermelon rind pickles represented the genius of turning would-be garbage into treasured food. Smothered pork chops arrived at nearly every funeral repast in heavy cast iron skillets, their rich onion gravy still bubbling from church kitchen stoves. Bone-in chops were seasoned with salt, pepper, and garlic powder before being dredged in flour and fried golden in lard. Sliced onions went into the drippings, cooked soft, then covered with broth to create gravy that simmered the meat tender. Church mothers knew this dish stretched far. 3 chops could feed a dozen mourners when spooned over rice. The aroma brought comfort to grieving families, filling fellowship halls with warmth words could not provide. Neighbors carried these skillets, still warm to bereaved households wrapped in towels. This dish cost pennies, yet delivered dignity when families needed it most. Seasoned salt foundation was the building block of flavor when elaborate spice blends were unavailable or too expensive. Grandmothers relied on Lawry's or homemade versions, combining salt, paprika, garlic powder, and onion powder into one convenient ingredient. This single seasoning went into flour, onto raw chicken before dipping, and sometimes over-finished pieces still glistening from the fryer. Layered application meant flavor hit at every stage. Homemade seasoned salt allowed adjustments and personal touches like cayenne or dried herbs. Batches were mixed in large quantities and stored in repurposed jars. Children learned to shake the jar before measuring to redistribute settled spices. The convenience meant even busy weeknight dinners had properly flavored chicken. This approach produced consistent results families depended upon. Potted meat sandwiches provided affordable protein when fresh meat remained far beyond the family budget. These small tins of processed meat paste cost only nickels and could feed multiple children when spread thin across bread. The paste was salty and intensely flavored, meaning a little went far in making plain bread taste substantial. Mothers would open a single tin and divide it among several sandwiches, stretching resources while ensuring everyone ate before school or work. Potted meat required no refrigeration before opening, ideal for pantries without ice boxes. The flavor was not gourmet, but hunger made it taste like provision and care. Children learned to appreciate what their families could provide. Factory workers carried these in metal pails, eating them cold at work sites where no heating was possible. Rice and kidney beans was a hearty one-pot meal that filled bellies and stretched budgets further than seemed possible. Dried kidney beans were soaked overnight, then simmered with ham hocks, onions, garlic, and bay leaves until they became creamy and rich. Rice was served alongside or stirred directly into the beans, creating a complete protein that nutritionists would later praise, but mothers already understood. The dish was seasoned with cayenne and thyme, giving it warmth that radiated from the inside out. Children would eat multiple bowls, not realizing they were consuming one of the healthiest and most economical meals their mothers could provide. Louisiana traditions heavily influenced this dish, but it appeared in Black kitchens across the entire South. Rice and kidney beans proved that poverty could never diminish flavor or love. Number 29, neck bone and rice. Pork neck bones sold for 19 cents a pound at the corner market in 1972, and a senior could feed herself for 3 days on 2 pounds. She covered the bones with water on the hot plate, dropped in a halved onion, a bay leaf, and a shake of red pepper, and let it work for an hour while she watched the stories. The broth turned the color of weak tea, and she pulled the meat off the knuckles with the same patience her mother used at the wash line. Long grain rice went into the pot last, swelling slow in that pork sweet broth. One pot fed Monday's supper, Tuesday's lunch over toast, and Wednesday's bowl with a little vinegar splashed on top. Folks called it leftover. Our elders called it stretched right. Number 26, sardines and soda crackers. A tin of sardines cost about 5 cents in 1930, and a sleeve of soda crackers cost 3. For under a dime, a Pullman porter could feed himself between Memphis and Cincinnati without setting foot in the white dining car. The tin opened with a key that doubled as a souvenir, and the oil from the fish soaked the crackers into something almost soft. Porters ate it sitting on the stairs of the baggage car, knees together, careful not to stain the trouser crease. It was an immigrant's meal, turned black working man's meal, turned railroad meal. It traveled well, never spoiled, and asked nothing of the man eating it. The empty tin went into the pail's bottom pocket on the return trip, useful for nails, buttons, or the small change a porter set aside for his daughter's school shoes once the run was done. Number 21, salt pork gravy, Overday old biscuits. No biscuit was ever thrown out in a black household in 1960 because a tough biscuit became the foundation for the cheapest gravy on the planet. 2 small cubes of salt pork rendered in a skillet until the bottom was coated in golden fat. A heaping spoon of flour stirred into the grease-brown slow, and then a cup of evaporated milk thinned with water got whisked in until the gravy was thick enough to coat the back of a spoon. The yesterday biscuits, hard and a little stale, got split open and laid in the bowl, and the gravy poured over them softened them right back to fresh. Working families in Memphis and Birmingham ate this twice a week through the winter months. It used what was already in the kitchen. It cost about a dime in ingredients, and it sat heavy enough to last a full morning of work. The plate went out the door warm, and the bowl came back empty by the second swallow. Cream chip beef on toast, one pan, 5 minutes, a single serving, was the breakfast that black women who had cooked for military families in the South during World War II brought back into their own kitchens, stripped to its essentials, and turned into something quiet and sustaining for mornings alone. The dish had been a military staple since the 1940s, served in mess halls across the country under a soldier's nickname that made officers wince. In civilian hands, it became more dignified, a roux of butter and flour cooked together for 30 seconds until pale and smooth, then a cup of milk poured in and whisked constantly until the whole thing thickened into a white sauce that clung to the back of the spoon. Dried beef, thin, translucent, intensely salty, went in last, pulled apart in rough pieces and stirred through. The whole thing spooned over 2 slices of toast, rich, filling, made from 4 shelf-stable ingredients in the time it took the bread to brown. She made it because she knew how. Nobody else in the house remembered it. Couscous was the Cajun and Creole fried cornmeal breakfast that most people outside Louisiana have never heard of, and most people inside Louisiana have stopped making. You made a thick batter from cornmeal, salt, baking powder, and milk, then scraped it into a cast iron skillet coated in bacon drippings. The key was that you did not stir it. You left the batter alone, let the bottom crust form, then broke it apart with a spatula into rough, crispy clumps. Then you poured warm milk and cane syrup over the plate and ate it immediately. The 1901 Picayune's Creole Cookbook documented couscous as a traditional Cajun farm kitchen breakfast. It was cheap, filling, and required a practiced hand. Most people under 60 have never tasted it. Most people over 80 remember it the way they remember a specific grandmother, vividly and with the knowledge that it is gone. The kerosene heater sat in the center of the main room, and there were rules around it that nobody wrote down. You didn't touch the wick adjustment. You didn't move it while it was burning. You cracked the window on the opposite wall 1 inch, no more, no less, because kerosene combustion consumes oxygen, and a sealed room was a dangerous room, but too much ventilation defeated the purpose. You checked the fuel level before bed and never let it fall past a quarter tank, because a sputtering wick threw soot into the air you breathed. By 1960, fuel oil and kerosene heated roughly 32% of American homes, and in the red line neighborhoods of Detroit and Chicago, where black families were locked out of mortgage programs that would have let them buy better insulated houses, a single portable heater was often the only supplemental heat between the family and a hard winter. The seniors who managed these heaters knew them intimately. They knew the sound of a wick burning right versus burning low. That knowledge was specific, operational, and largely died with them. If the kerosene heater's reach was limited by distance, the answer was to shrink the distance. You didn't need a recipe for ash roasted sweet potatoes. You needed a fireplace and the patience to wait. The potatoes went straight into the ashes after the fire burned low. No foil, no pan, just raw sweet potato buried in hot coals and left alone for close to an hour. The skin blackened and cracked, but underneath, the flesh turned soft, caramelized, custard-like, with a sweetness no oven could replicate. Booker T. Washington described eating sweet potatoes roasted this way as an enslaved child in Virginia, and the practice continued in black households well into the 1960s, as long as families still had hearths or wood-burning stoves. You knew they were done by pressing the side. If the skin gave and the inside felt like it was about to collapse, they were ready. No one used a thermometer. No one set a timer. The knowing was in your hands, passed down from whoever taught you to build a fire in the first place. Kids burned their fingers, pulling them from the coals, splitting them open, and watching the steam rise. That steam smelled like winter itself, sweet, smoky, and gone too fast. If ash and heat could unlock a sweet potato, cold and time did the same for persimmons. Number 15, smothered turkey wings. A pound of fresh turkey wings cost 19 cents at the meat counter in 1957. Most white shoppers passed the wings by because they didn't know what to do with them. Your grandmother knew exactly what to do. She washed the wings in cold water, dredged them in flour, seasoned with salt, black pepper, garlic powder, and a pinch of poultry seasoning, and browned them in a skillet of bacon grease until the skin was crisp like paper. Then the wings went into a deep pot with 2 yellow onions, 3 stalks of celery, and 4 cups of water. The lid went on. The pot simmered on the back burner for 2.5 hours. By supper time, the meat was falling off the bone and the broth had turned into a thick mahogany gravy. She served the wings over rice with the gravy ladled across both. 6 children licked their fingers clean. You'd watch the wing bones get picked over twice. Hog maw separated reunion guests into those who grew up eating it and those who couldn't get past its origins. The pig stomach was cleaned thoroughly, stuffed with seasoned sausage, potatoes, and cabbage, then roasted until everything melded into savory richness. Women prepared it the day before, letting it cool so flavors set before slicing into thick rounds. The texture was chewy and satisfying, the filling spilling out in aromatic layers, mixing on the plate. Some families simmered hog maw in broth instead of roasting, creating heartier, stew-like dishes. Either way, it stretched expensive sausage with cheap vegetables into meals feeding many. Elders who remembered lean times appreciated every bite for what it represented. Hog maw proved resourcefulness, created dishes worth passing down. Chicken and rice fed multitudes at funeral repasts, a single bird stretching across dozens of servings when combined with cheap grain and rich gravy. The chicken was first boiled whole until the meat fell from bones, then shredded and returned to the pot with rice that absorbed every bit of flavor from the broth. Onions, celery, and bay leaves added the depth, while black pepper provided warmth. The dish cooked together until the rice turned creamy and the chicken distributed evenly throughout. This was one-pot cooking at its most practical, easy to transport, simple to serve, and satisfying to eat. Church kitchens could prepare enormous batches in the hours before services ended. For families with little money to contribute, chicken and rice represented honest effort and genuine nourishment. The dish filled plates and bellies without pretense. Garlic powder layering built flavor from the inside out rather than just sprinkling seasoning on the surface. Grandmothers rubbed garlic powder directly onto the raw chicken before the buttermilk soak, then added more to the flour coating. This double application meant garlic flavor penetrated the meat while also seasoning the crust. Fresh garlic would burn in hot grease, but the powder withstood frying temperatures and bloomed into something rich and savory. The technique worked because garlic's oils needed time to penetrate, and the overnight soak gave them that time. Children grew up associating the smell of garlic-scented flour with Sunday afternoons. The layered approach meant no single bite lacked seasoning, solving the problem of bland chicken hidden under flavorful coating. This was flavor engineering before anyone called it that. Leftover rice balls transformed yesterday's dinner into today's portable lunch. Families shaped cold rice into firm balls, sometimes adding bits of meat or vegetables, then wrapped them in cloth for transport. The rice held together when properly packed, creating a self-contained meal requiring no bread or utensils. In Gullah communities along the Carolina coast, rice was the staple grain at every meal. Leftover rice was never wasted because it could always become tomorrow's lunch. Workers carried rice balls in pockets or pails, eating them by hand during breaks. Children found them easier to manage than sandwiches, the compact shape fitting small hands. The technique came from African foodways where rice balls had sustained travelers for generations. This lunch connected Black Americans to ancestral wisdom about stretching grain. Those 60 dishes carried families through some of the hardest years this country has ever seen, and most of them still taste just as good today. Drop a comment and tell us which one your family still makes. If your grandmother had a recipe that belongs on this list, we want to hear about it. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and check out the video on screen right now for more of the food that built Black America. We'll see you there.